Well, good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this TAROE Trust webinar, the Charter for Social Housing, a conversation with the Regulator of Social Housing. My name's Andrew Gray, and I'm the Member Relationships Manager at Fusion 21, and we're delighted to be hosting this event this morning as part of our partnership with the TAROE Trust, where Fusion 21 has been supporting their valuable work that they do with tenants and residents across the country. I'd like to really welcome you all again, as I said, and before I go on to the formal part of the session, I just want to do a couple of housekeeping points. Firstly, it's to say that if you are not familiar with the GoToWebinar, you should be seeing the control panel on the right hand side of your screen. If you want to reduce the size of that panel, you can click the orange button. If you're having any issues with audio, you can click on the audio and hopefully change the audio settings. So sometimes if those problems persist, you can turn off and turn back on again is often the best course of action. But perhaps most importantly, we do want you to use the Q&A button. We want to make this as interactive as possible. And whilst you, the audience, will be on mute, we want to make sure that you have an opportunity to raise any questions that you have. If any problems with sound and vision continue, then again, just to reassure you that we are taking a recording of this webinar, and we'll be making that available on both the TAROE Trust website and the Fusion 21 website in the near future. So moving swiftly on, I'm now delighted to welcome the panel, and we have Fiona MacGregor, who's the Chief Executive of the Regulator for Social Housing, Darren Hartley, Chief Executive of the TAROE Trust, Leslie Channon, the Public Affairs and Tenant Engagement Consultant at the TAROE Trust, and Rob Gershon, the Tenant Campaigner and Council House Tenant. So we're going to start. We haven't got any formal presentations, but I'm going to pass over first now to Darren for just a few introductory remarks, and then he'll pass on to Fiona, who will also then make some introductory remarks. So Darren, over to you.
Thank you, Andrew, and good morning, everybody. Great to see the numbers turn out for today's webinar session. Big thank you in particular to Fiona for joining us from the RSH, and also to Rob to provide his perspectives from as a tenant within the sector. And definitely one of the things which we're hoping to achieve through this webinar and future webinars is to try and address the balance so that there is an opportunity for tenant perspectives to be raised and to be part of the general debate around both the delivery of the Charter for Social Housing and more generally within the sector. Also, a big thank you to Fusion 21 for letting us use this platform and for chairing this session for us. So, a few more preliminaries. We think it's really important that tenants and residents have the opportunity to be able to contribute to the debate on this, and really the white paper has placed that firmly back onto the agenda. As Andrew said, we'd be interested in receiving any kind of views, and particularly views. We are joined today by a number of tenants and residents within the sector. So yeah, we'd encourage you to raise questions so that we can kind of have a more interactive session here. What I was hoping to do before I hand over to the kind of star of the show is just to kind of put the TAROE Trust perspective onto this, We've obviously been campaigning for change in the sector for quite a while, so we've been overall really pleased with the contents of the charter and the direction of travel, which is clearly given within the white paper. I guess one of the things which would be great to kind of get as part of those interactive discussions later is things as to whether we're on the right course, whether we've got things right. It's important that we're in listening mode here, and if there's things which we're missing, that you can kind of put those perspectives across to us as well, so that we can incorporate that. The idea ultimately is that we have a manifesto for change which largely summarises our priorities and campaign priorities, and we recognise that now needs, particularly in light of the charter, to be updated and reviewed, but we can only do that if that's reflective of the views of tenants and residents across the sector. So initial responses is that, you know, it's a really good starting point. There's a lot of positives within there, a lot of things which we've already been calling for in the Manifesto for Change. So we're seeing a move towards stronger consumer regulation. We've always called for that. We think it's the same, or the flip side of the coin of economic regulation. And we need to make sure that both of those are equally regulated. We've seen, as already we've seen a number of changes that the Housing Ombudsman has been introducing, and certainly the Charter furthers and improves on complaints handling. TAROE Trust has done a lot of that over the years in terms of advocacy and support for tenants. So again, it's continued the debate around the need for enhanced building safety, particularly seen alongside the Building Safety Bill and some other additional legislation on building and fire safety. There's increased obligations and opportunities for tenants to be engaged in the debate. And definitely, you know, improved housing standards. For instance, the decent home standards, which are really, you know, the standards by which all landlords should at least make a minimum kind of threshold, are kind of over 20 years old now. And we've very much been asking for, saying that it needs to be updated to reflect where we are in society, not least things around the sustainability agenda, as well as fuel poverty issues, which are increasingly challenging, and something which tenants and residents have highlighted to us in recent years. And it's good also that there has been recognition of the need for continued supply. That there is a massive shortage of housing, and particularly affordable housing. Though, of course, we have highlighted that we've got some reservations there, especially on the lack of commitments to rented accommodation. Other kind of things where we might have liked to see some more on this is around reinforcement of the points which were in the original green paper around stigma. I mean, the line that TAROE Trust has taken for many years now is that we think that the rented sector should be a sector of choice. It represents a legitimate tenure and should be not seen as a lesser form of tenure to home ownership, though we recognise that some people home ownership, that's what's right for them. There's going to be increased ability for comparability and tenant satisfaction measures, which were kind of majored within the charter. I guess one of the kind of initial thoughts that I've got there is that already the use of acronyms and TSMs as opposed to tenant satisfaction measures is just kind of there's a reminder there, isn't there, for us all to make things as accessible as possible to tenants and residents, to stop putting that kind of overlay which just puts people off. We were disappointed, obviously, that there's no formal recognition of the need for a national platform for tenants, and obviously we have long stated our position that we think that that's important in terms of influencing national policy decision making. And there's not a lot there that was offered for formal tenant groups. We recognise that there's been a lot of work, particularly in recent years, around scrutiny panels and so forth, and certainly they have the benefits and advantages, but sometimes you get a different perspective around from independent groups of tenants. And then obviously there are some kind of more practical challenges which are presented around implementing all of this, challenges around the timescales. It was such a long time which we know that we were waiting for the release of the charter on the back of the green paper, 2 years, and that some of the changes are going to require legislation in order to implement as well. So again, it's further waiting. Our view has been it's important to get things right, and therefore it's better to wait and to get things right than to kind of rush through and then for the system to be suboptimal in any way. And obviously we're going to need to implement all of this with the spectre of COVID-19 and the pandemic restrictions, which have challenged the way all of us both work and operate and live our lives, and not least within the challenges that are there for engagement with tenants and residents. I guess what we could say there around some of those responses is that whilst that might not necessarily be in the charter, it doesn't mean that landlords can't take the initiative and look to commit to some of those other things as well, where it's within their gift to do so, and really embrace what is a clear message from the charter, that tenants and residents need to be an integral part and at the heart of housing service delivery in this country. So to summarise, significant shift towards consumer matters. I don't think it's really a return to the old Tenant Services Authority that we had previously, that some of you might remember, but we think it is an important shift back of the pendulum. It's really good to see that the importance of effective engagement has been recognised. The resident engagement, which as part of that co-regulatory model is primarily that relationship between landlords and tenants, but backed up by strong regulation and national housing policy, that there are going to be increased rights and powers of residents, and we're going to do our bit to try and highlight where they are so that tenants are better informed as well about what those rights and obligations are. But yes, recognising that there are some significant gaps still there as well, and that there's a lot that all stakeholders as part of this arrangement can do to deliver on this agenda. So as we stand, there's a lot that's going to need to happen, and a lot of that is going to fall on the regulator. So with sharp timing, I'm delighted to kind of hand over to the regulator and to Fiona and to hear what she has to say about the challenges that lie ahead. So over to you, Fiona. Thank you.
Darren, thanks so much, and thank you for that really sort of comprehensive. Hang on 1 second, I've just lost something. Comprehensive overview of the white paper. I just wanted to start firstly by saying actually thank you to TAROE and to Fusion 21 for inviting me to come along today. And I think Andrew said at the start, this is a conversation, and I hope it is a conversation even if it's through written chat online. So that would be really great. And it is really nice to see all my fellow panellists. So it's good to see Leslie and Rob and Andrew as well as Darren. So thank you for today. Darren's picked up a bit about what's in the content of the white paper already, and I'm not going to repeat all of that. I think the things I would draw attention to by way of just opening remarks is, the first thing is when you look at the themes, and it's the themes of the kind of the 7 chapters and what's come out of the white paper. Hopefully lots of you who were involved at the time will kind of recognise that golden thread of which kind of was the genesis of the white paper itself, obviously starting with triggered by the tragedy of the Grenfell Tower fire, and the roundtables that ministers held subsequent to that. And I think this reflects, I hope you recognise that it reflects a lot of what ministers heard in there. And we've heard some good positive feedback that there are some things that haven't been covered, but tenants and residents do recognise some of the points that were being raised at those roundtables. And I think that golden thread has continued, from the conversations through the Green Paper, and for the most part now through into the White Paper. And the White Paper covers a range of areas. A more proactive consumer regulation regime is a very big bit of that, but it's not absolutely all of it. So there are some other things in the White Paper that others will take forward, but we recognise our role, the role that we've been given, is a significant element of delivering the Charter and delivering the ambitions of the White Paper. And it is fair to say, we do really welcome the White Paper, not least, Darren talked about this. I see this as a rebalancing of where things had got to. And some of this predates my time, certainly as a regulator, but that kind of pendulum swing which led to the position we're in at the minute, and that position will remain statutorily true for some time, where the bar, the requirements for us to intervene on consumer matters moved from being proactive to being reactive, and our enforcement powers were limited to being used only where we could see or there was a risk of serious detriment. And that pendulum swing, I think, had gone right round when those changes were introduced. You might have views about the theology of why that was done and whether or not it was ever going to work. But I think there's a general recognition that the pendulum coming back, and I hope this is a pendulum swing back into the middle rather than kind of flip-flopping about from kind of one extreme to the other. We really do welcome that. And Darren has already said this, but it is worth reinforcing. There are synergies, we think. It is two sides of a kind of overall piece, if you like, that you can do proactive consumer regulation alongside proactive economic regulation. Of course, there's a nuance there in terms of the coverage of local authorities and our role in respect of local authorities, and we'll have to work through how we do that. Just to be, we don't have a governance role with local authorities, so we'll have to work through what that means. But some of the fundamentals remain absolutely true. Any revised consumer standards in due course will apply equally to all social landlords, whether it's a housing association in old money or a local authority. So firstly, the consumer standards will apply to everyone. And secondly, the outcomes, because they will be outcome focused, the outcomes should not be different from a tenant and resident perspective, depending on the kind of landlord that you have. There may be ways, nuances in actually how we go about the regulation, but it's to get to the same outcomes as opposed to there being any difference between the two. So that's the first thing I would say. And I've kind of touched on this already. There are, and again, Darren said some of this, it will involve some building blocks. So before we can get to the kind of overall implementation, and we think it's really important to try and do this as a whole in the round, because it will be more effective once we get there. So the building blocks involve, in the first instance, actually, there will need to be legislation will need to be taken to give us some extra objectives, to change some of our powers, to remove the serious detriment test, things like that. So building block number one is legislation. We need a legislative slot for that. We don't have a legislative slot confirmed yet. That's a government decision, and there's quite a lot of competition, as you'll be aware, for legislative slots at the minute, given how much else is going on in the world. And then I won't get into too much kind of techie detail about that, but once you've got legislation, the government directs us on a range of the consumer standards, including things like decent homes, which is separately being consulted on, or will be being consulted on. So the government directs us on some of our consumer standards. That will have to happen. They'll have to consult before they do that. And once they've done that, we will have to formulate, and we could, some of these things will run in parallel. We don't wait till something's completely finished before we then start the next stage, but you have to do some of the formalities in sequence. So we'll formulate revised consumer standards, including anything we've been directed on, and then we will consult on those consumer standards. And one of the things I would really want to emphasise, and we'll keep saying this, and I'm really sorry because we will bore you all to tears eventually, but the consumer standards genuinely matter, and getting those right genuinely matters, because that is the absolute base of everything else that we do. And I'll come on to some other things in a second, but the consumer standards is what we can regulate against, and so we have to get that right. The consumer standards, therefore, we need to make sure that there's things that they address broadly the right areas. There are things that matter to tenants. There are things that landlords can implement. All of that has to kind of be thought through. And as I say, that is the bedrock of what we do. There are other bits of the package that in some cases have attracted more attention for reasons I entirely understand, but the other bits are tools to help us understand whether or not the consumer standards are being met. They are not ends in themselves. So again, Darren mentioned the tenant satisfaction measures, and there are some suggestions outlined in the white paper itself. I think there's 24 of those. Getting those right will really matter, but they will be a means to an end. They will tell us things about whether or not the consumer standards are being met. So we'll want to, it's one of the first things we'll be coming out to talk to people about is, do the tenant satisfaction measures cover broadly the right areas? Are they the things that matter to tenants? Are they, can you gather the data on them? Can you give us the information on them? There's all sorts of techie stuff that much cleverer people than me within our organisation can talk a lot about, because I've heard them about, can you make them generally comparable? Is it possible to kind of introduce a set of standards that insofar as possible people don't game? You want a set of consumer standards where tenant satisfaction measures that don't drive perverse behaviours or perverse incentives, or don't become an end in themselves. You don't kind of teach to the test so that people focus on that and don't focus on the overall, are you delivering a good service to your tenants and residents? So all of those things are kind of really, really important. And we don't want to end up with a set of measures where everybody's, the only interest is, am I in the top quartile? And we have seen it. We have seen kind of instances where it's mathematically or arithmetically impossible for 100% of organisations to be in the top 25%. That just, that's a quart into a pint pot. But we need to make sure we get those things right. Those will matter. So we will talk to you about those. And the other thing that's attracted a lot of attention, and this takes you back to the, are we going back to TPAS days, is the use of the term inspection in the white paper. And I think in an ideal world, we'd like to come up with something different by way of a term to kind of differentiate between what we think this might look like going forward. But these are all tools, and the key thing is that we get the consumer standards right. So really emphasising this is important as a whole. This has to fit together and work as a whole. And I've alluded a number of times in what I've said so far, and we'll want to talk to people about this. I mean, I've said already this will take time. We will want to use that time wisely to talk to landlords, to talk to tenants, to talk to tenant representative bodies, to try and develop this system, the regulatory framework in the round, the standards, the tenant satisfaction measures, our operational model, including what we might do around inspections. We'll want to talk to people to get that right, and we'll use that time, I hope, wisely to do so. And what I've set us 3 tests, I think, for what I think we should be trying to get out of this. The first thing, one of the first tests that we'll keep asking ourselves about is, will this make a genuine difference to tenants' experience? And that is test number 1. but you can't meet test number 1 if actually what we put in place is a system that landlords themselves just cannot deliver because we've asked them to do something that's just impossible. So this isn't to say it's going to be easy or soft or any of those things, but landlords do need to be given something that is achievable to deliver. Now, you read the white paper and that should be very straightforward, because in many respects what's in the white paper is just basics, it's fundamentals. Arguably it's things that people should be getting right already, so you know, but it does need to be something that landlords can achieve and deliver. And then the test that probably matters more to me than to anyone else, but or us than anyone else, is we also need to be able to regulate against it, and that speaks back to getting the standards right in the first instance. So those are our tests. And I hope that one of the things that tenants will see, actually even before we get to kind of full implementation, is that landlords are really kind of focusing on this. It's something that, you know, as I say, arguably they should be doing, should be getting right now. Regulation should be a backstop. The fundamental relationship remains that relationship between landlords and tenants. So hopefully what people will see in the meantime is landlords really starting to focus on this, looking at where they could improve their services, you know, starting to do that proactively. And as we get to full implementation and beyond, I think this is all about trying to, it's a kind of, I hesitate to use the term because it's got political connotations now in ways that are slightly unfortunate, but I think this is about levelling up. It's about, we will now, or in due course, we will have powers not just to act when somebody refers something to us, or look when somebody refers something to us, but to get assurance that this has been proactively met by providers and that boards and indeed councillors are taking this very seriously and can demonstrate, and we can look and see whether or not there are outliers, and you're starting to try and raise the bar for everybody to improve the tenant experience. And I think that is the outcome we should all be trying to look for. So I'll stop in 1 second. The kind of the final thing I think I'd just like to say, alongside the 3 tests that I've outlined, is we work on the basis of some key principles on what we do currently on our proactive economic regulation, and those principles are that it's a kind of, we work on a co-regulatory basis with landlords, so it's for landlords to get assurance that they're meeting the standards, and then to be able to provide that assurance to us, and we can probe if we have if we don't think that we're getting that assurance adequately. And when co-regulation was first introduced, it was 3-pronged. It wasn't just between regulator and landlords, it was tenants and landlords as well, and tenants getting the information to be able to hold their landlords to account and question them in a meaningful way about the services that were being delivered. So the co-regulation, we think, remains and should remain a bedrock of how we take this forward. We work on an assurance basis, I've alluded to that, which is, you know, we're not here to tell landlords how to do it and give them any kind of tick box type approach, and you know, if you do this you're fine, because it takes you back to things like teaching to the test. It will be inappropriate in different circumstances for different communities, different kinds of you know, geographies, different objectives of you know, individual organisations, all of those things. So this isn't tick box. We want to remain outcome focused. What matters is that tenants are being delivered a good service in the round. And so outcomes is a kind of key point for us. So co-regulation, assurance-based, outcome-focused are principles that we will aim to hold on to as we work this through going forward. I've just talked at you for a solid 15 minutes at least. I'm going to stop, and it would be good to get to the chat before the end of our session. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Fiona. Some really insightful points. Please, audience, please do continue to use the question and answer box to send your questions in, and again, we have a few of them. But in terms of just moving the debate on, I'm going to come to you first, Rob, in terms of, you know, as a tenant on the panel, just to give your sort of overview of the white paper, and how you think we should be going forward. Particularly, I think, picking up Fiona's point around that clear focus on getting the consumer standards right.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew, and thanks, Fiona, for sort of managing to squeeze all that information into what was a relatively short amount of time, and I shall try and do the same. I'm going to pick up on what was really Fiona's last point there about it being outcomes based, and I think for those of us who are sort of tenants who have been involved in the co-regulatory sphere, you know, and that's not all tenants, is it? But a lot of tenants just want outcomes, and I think the stuff that fed into the green paper and came out of the green paper through the ministerial roadshows, for me, and I certainly wasn't in as much attendance as Leslie and Darren, who sort of went to nearly all of them, but I went to a couple of them, and for me, a lot of the things that tenants wanted were about those very basic things, and more importantly, about being communicated with about them or just talked to about them. I think much of the stuff that came up through the green paper for me was about this kind of breakdown in communications between landlords and residents. And I think what's been reassuring in the, I'm going to try and call it the Charter for Social Housing Residents, I'm going to try and get away from white paper, is that actually, you know, those 24 tenant satisfaction measures, and I agree with Darren that the jargon isn't really helpful, but actually those examples are about trying to get back to a way of making sure that the people who live in the neighbourhoods and communities that make up social housing and the, you know, other kinds of tenures that they share space with aren't ignored, which I think a lot of us had a sense was happening for many years. And particularly in terms of the role of the regulator, I think I've been in a load of conversations over the years where people have said the consumer standards aren't a bad set of standards, but they don't have any teeth. There is nobody there, or previously there hasn't been anybody there at the end of the day to make sure that if those standards are breached, and yes, there are exceptions for serious detriment, but if people as landlords completely fail to listen to their residents, and there's nothing to stop them doing that. There hasn't previously been anything to stop them doing it, and there still isn't. And for me, this kind of then breaks down into how we risk tick box exercises, all those things Fiona identified as risks. It's much too easy to set up a, what does somebody call it once, a compliance culture, where landlords and their residents they choose to be involved residents kind of end up making themselves look good in public, when actually what most of us who live in social housing want, which I'm sure is the same as people who live in any kind of housing, is just to live somewhere safe and warm and decent and affordable. And part of that, as the Grenfell Tower tragedy highlighted, is about things like building and fire safety, but another huge part of it, and the ongoing Grenfell inquiries is highlighting stuff about this every day, is that communities have been ignored for a long time. And for me, the kind of the Charter for Residents is a framework to moving towards that not happening anymore. And even at this early stage, like Fiona being here today is an indicator, I think, and I've found it easier to get other people from the regulator to come out into the world and talk to people directly. And I think that's, you know, it's not anything that's set in stone, and it's not anything that has been legislated for, but for me it's reassuring that people are willing to come out from the regulator and talk to residents like directly rather than have to go through landlords. The Housing Ombudsman is just setting up a resident panel of about 100 residents, and my feeling is that perhaps, you know, something along those lines could work in the regulatory space as well, maybe, or perhaps we could just share those same people. It sounds like the Ombudsman's hoping to turn them over fairly regularly. For me, you can't just use the Ombudsman as a model, because that is very much focused on complaints. And my own personal reaction to some of the housing sector's response to the Charter is that I think there is a focus on complaints, which is perhaps a little bit narrow, I think, from my point of view. Kind of only been doing this 5 or 6 years, but during that time, we talk a lot about the exemplars, about sort of Phoenix community housing and what SOHA have done to some extent in going mutual. And we kind of can name places where we can think of examples of landlords. I hesitate to say doing things better, because it's not about making a league table about it. You know, not everyone's going to be in the top 1%. But for me, it's about taking the ideas behind why some landlords are prepared to bring residents into their decision making and seeing how we can spread that more widely. And for me, that's what the charter element of the charter is about, really. It is just kind of setting out that if you have residents who want to be more involved, or if you have residents who have issues with how their communities are being managed, there should be a way through what we have always had, the tenant involvement and empowerment standards, through those consumer standards, not just of sorting out complaints and problems, but of co-designing services so that people are getting what they want. And one of the other exemplars we often use, it's now Optivo, but when it was Affinity, was it Affinity Sutton? Oh, I always get them confused, so many landlords.
Amicus Horizon.
Amicus Horizon, yeah, I knew it was 2 words and the first one began with an A. But with apologies to everyone involved. But for me, when they were kind of on the verge of going under years ago, they went and knocked on everyone's door and said, what is it that you want? And this helped them to save millions of pounds in the services they're delivering. So even if it's not a kind of lovey-dovey, we have to do what our tenants are telling us sort of thing, there is a business case for getting this stuff right from my point of view. I also think the stuff that's come directly, you know, I don't want to always take it back to Grenfell, but the stuff around changing the consumer standards so that, oh gosh, how to put it? I mean, Fiona said about doing the basics, and there's a quote I've heard previously that isn't very polite about, you know, just do the basics and don't be rude to people. I try and be a bit more polite about it than it was recounted to me. But I think one of the things about the charter is that some of that do the basics right has actually been a bit disappointing. I think it's a shame we've had to spell it out in a lot of cases, but that's kind of borne out of the fact that some landlords aren't and don't do it, and that needs to change. And that's not about punishment for me. You know, I'm pleased that the regulator will have more powers once the legislation has been carried out. But in a way, it's not even about a deterrent. It's just about where we've talked about for years about culture change, about really, even though there will be, you know, what sounds like a separate staffing team for consumer regulation, and there will be specific outcomes that landlords have to meet, it's still not for me really about the regulation and the legislation. It is about kind of making sure that, I was going to say everyone's happy at the end of the day. That's never going to happen, but it is just about kind of rebalancing the relationship, which is the thing that came through the green paper for me. Just very briefly, I'd like to talk about stigma a little bit, because I think there has been a wide feeling that it was something that came up a lot in the green paper, as was loneliness, strangely enough. And I think that's kind of taken on an entirely new aspect in the pandemic years, and it's still something we're perhaps not getting right. But it sort of took a health crisis for landlords to spend their time ringing people up to check how they are. And there's been a lot of positive press about that, and I'm in favour of that sort of thing. But it just kind of, it's a little bit frustrating that something so disastrous has had to happen in order to get, you know, landlords to talk directly to tenants. But is my own feeling. But I've lost the thread of where I was going before I got onto that. I'm so sorry.
No, I mean, I think Rob, that you know, that's a really good point, and it picks up on sort of a couple of other sort of questions that have been coming through, and perhaps then I'm going to sort of, you know, address this sort of directly to Fiona, which is around, again, you mentioned in your introductory comments that the regime, particularly around, I mean, we'll call it inspection, is everyone and everybody is going to be covered by the standards. So there's this issue of, we're not going back to where we were, but smaller organisations were perhaps not subject to such rigorous inspection as larger ones. And also some of the comments have come through is about the whole resources issue, in terms of, again, is a 4-year cycle of inspection the right one? And, if it is about what gets measured gets done, again, it's about how we, in that co-regulatory environment, and ensure that everybody does get a say, and again, that tenants within, whether or not it be the smallest almshouse through to the largest local authority or largest social landlord, do really have the ability to have a say in how their organisation is run, and have the opportunity to, perhaps whistle blow when it isn't.
Andrew, thank you, and Rob, thank you. I was scribbling away as you were writing, because there was so many, so much good stuff in that. So thanks very much for that. It was great. So yeah, I mean, I will probably say this lots of times: we shouldn't get entirely hung up on inspections. It's a tool; it's part of the toolkit. But as I said, when I was comparing housing associations to local authorities, the standards do apply to all landlords. And the inspection regime, insofar as there was kind of set out in the white paper, suggested a 4-year cycle. And that's partly because that's broadly in line with what we do on the economic side of larger landlords, over 1,000 homes on IDAs. And that, we have to say, that does speak to, there is a resource point in that. Of course there's a resource point in that, which I'll come back to. But what it shouldn't mean is that you end up with either different outcomes for tenants of smaller landlords, or indeed that if things are going wrong, we don't do something about it. That will not, that is not the outcome that will happen. So things like whatever measures we end up with, whether it's the current suite of tenant satisfaction measures, an amended suite of whatever it is, that will have to apply to everybody. There are obligations on landlords to, this is the co-regulation point, to tell us if they're at risk of not meeting the standards. That works for most. You talked about people whistleblowing. If it's more than just the individual complaint, which in the first instance gets routed through the Ombudsman, and I think that's probably right, and they have a specific role on individual dispute resolution, which I think they're very effective at, and that's all good. But if there's something that speaks to the kind of, it's an organisational failure rather than a kind of more of an individual dispute, of course that can be raised with us. And although we probably wouldn't get to a point where we were systematically carrying out an inspection, or in whatever form we put that together, and as I said, we'll talk to people. Although we probably wouldn't get to the point where we're doing that of every single provider. I mean, literally, genuinely turning up to inspect. And we don't inspect property, we're looking at the assurance that the landlords are meeting the standards. That's what we're after. Doing that for a one property almshouse, for example, might be a disproportionate use of everybody's resources. And that matters. The reason the resources matter is that the kind of treasury with theology, the principles are that at the point at which any regulator, no matter what they're regulating, the regulation applies to everyone, then it is paid for through fees, and in due course the sector, there's a slight nuance for local authorities, but the sector will have to pay our costs through fees. So there is rightly something incumbent on us to provide good value for money for those fees, and not have an absolute standing army that costs a fortune, because essentially it comes out of your landlord's income, and it affects what your landlords have got left by way of income to either improve services, invest in existing homes, or even contribute towards new homes, new affordable homes. So there is a valid point, I think, about resources, none of which is to say that if there's a problem that either somebody refers to us and we think, yeah, absolutely right, we can see evidence that there's an issue here, or actually we're not sure, we can go in and do an inspection. It's not restrictive. That we might just have a programme every 4 years of the larger landlords. We can go in, we can do reactive stuff, we can ask for that assurance, we can use our powers. So all of that goes towards the overall whole. And I think there is, I hope, an effective middle ground that means that outcome focus that applies, and the standards applying to all tenants, can be implemented effectively without, we have a duty to be proportionate, without us doing so in a very heavy-handed way that costs lots of money and actually is not necessary because it doesn't improve the outcomes in the round.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for that. It was interesting. There's a comment from one of our tenants in terms of the cost of regulation and/or the cost of if anyone was fined, and actually it being a double whammy for tenants in terms of they've had to cope with poor service. Then on top of it, they are actually paying for that as well. So again, it's interesting in terms of, at the end of the day, the majority of this, or all of this, is tenants' rent money. I'm going to bring Leslie in, and I wonder, in terms of just perhaps sort of sharing some of your overviews, and in particular, it's about perhaps leading some of the mistakes that as a sector we've made in the past and learning from them, and also perhaps you could address the issue. There is clearly an issue Fiona mentioned in terms of timetable, but also a sense of I still can't believe that most landlords aren't already committed to doing this and actually getting on and doing it. And I just wonder, from your perspective, again, a sense of let's not wait. Let's actually, because it is really part of what we should be doing at this moment in time.
Thank you, Andrew. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of what Fiona, Darren, and Rob have already said is just, I think, being able to use best practice examples within the sector to be able to get your house in order now, so that you are doing the right thing. I mean, I think from my kind of broad stroke overview of what I know, I mean, I think 1/3 of landlords are already doing really well. I mean, I know that when I worked at Soha, it was really amazing what they were able to do with their tenants, and then move into a mutual model. Same with Optivo when they were Amicus Horizon. I would like to see a value for money measure on the consumer side of resident involvement, because there is a money savings that if you bring tenants into the conversation, to me, it's just not rocket science. Like, if you bring tenants into the conversation and say, okay, this is how much we have to spend, say, for example, on these block of flats, how would you like the money, this is going to cost this much, this is going to cost this much, and have the conversation so they understand the wider picture. Whereas if you have a bunch of suits sat around the table saying, yes, that, they're going to want, grounds maintenance, well, actually, if you actually talk to tenants, they want to make sure that the lift is operating 365 days a year, and that's where they want the money focused. And that's from the research I did with Amicus Horizon in my dissertational research. That is what they were able to do, and to build bridges. And I think that, like Rob said, it shouldn't have to take a global pandemic or a Grenfell tragedy to actually listen to tenants. And I think that there has to be a way that there's always going to be tenants that want to work with landlords. There's always going to be tenants that are agitated and angry no matter what you do. And there has to be a way of the conversation to allow, you know, the pesky tenants, the angry tenants to be heard. Because if you block them or don't want to talk to them or just dismiss them, you're going to miss vital information. So I think there's a way of being able to bring people on board and enter the conversation and manage expectations. And I think it starts with, like what Rob said, basic picking up the phone and having conversations, and, you know, also being willing to admit when you're wrong. I think that is a really powerful thing to say, we got it wrong. And, you know, I absolutely love it when I see in annual reports, you said, we listened, we changed this is the outcome. And, you know, the other thing that I'm going to quickly say is with league tables, it kind of does my head in, because as a tenant, I don't care whether my landlord is number 1 or number 556. I want my repairs done right first time. I want to be able to call and make a complaint. I want to be able to engage with because the thing is I don't have the choice. Like, if I'm going to a grocery store and they upset me, I have a choice to change grocery stores. I can't say, oh, I want to have my neighbor's landlord. I don't have a choice to then opt in to a different landlord. So I think league tables might be a good use of, you know, batting, you know, or competing with each other, not wanting to be shamed. But I think that, you know, for me, it's about getting services right first time, having the conversations and bringing people on board. So
yeah.
There.
Yeah, thanks for that. I'm going to bring Darren out, because again, I think, Leslie, you made that point, and again, it's something that came up in questions again, and it was something that in one of my other roles, I chair TAROE's Landlords Operations Committee, and you know, it's fascinating in terms of that whole culture change. And we had a recent review of complaints. Residents are involved in that, and fundamentally it was about a lot of the issues were around the culture within the organization. And Rob, how do you think that does need to change to embrace what we're trying to achieve as a result of this new charter?
I think, well, fortunately, this picks up on what I forgot I was talking about earlier, where there isn't anything specific in the charter about stigma, but actually there's a bit of work going on in Clarion already, and I know some other landlords are starting to look at not just the broader stigma. I mean, we've talked for years about the disadvantages of things like Benefit Street and the wider discussion about social housing, but there's a kind of recognition that some of the ways in which landlords interact with residents can also be stigmatizing. And for me, therefore, a sort of picking up on that element of it will be a way of improving just how people communicate with each other. Does that answer your question specifically? Possibly not. But the other thing, I'll put it here rather than talk about it later, for me, is that where we're still talking about the tenant satisfaction measures, and we don't like the name, and where specifically we don't know what the consumer regulations are going to look like, this is the time now where kind of residents have an opportunity to come up with ideas so that we aren't 10 years down the line worrying about whether people are meeting these standards. We've got an opportunity now to shape the way that what we think of as good practice or best practice, you know, how that actually looks when it comes to the kind of organizational structures and the organizational culture, really. And I think it's not, the culture change isn't all about stigma, but it is just about kind of taking this time. And again, we're talking about time a lot, and I'm finding how long everything's taking quite frustrating. You know, I kind of almost gave up on the entire house. I did give up on the entire housing thing last year because the white paper, the charter, hadn't come out, and nothing seems to have progressed together with tenancies going on, but we still don't really know what shape it is, and that is possibly should be more about governance. And there's a load of kind of separate stuff that's happening, which is good, but for me it all needs to be tied together so that we have some sense of what we mean when we say culture change. You know, what do we want what do we want organisations to look like? Not because it's a structural thing, but because so that they can deliver the outcomes that they're supposed to within this new consumer standard structure, which is still being formed, in my opinion. So I think there's room for us to save ourselves as tenants and landlords and the regulator a lot of work in future by getting this stuff right now. Is that near enough?
Yeah, no, that's great. Darren, I know you wanted to make a point around the sort of sector shifts and culture.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Yeah, I mean, something that Leslie mentioned a moment ago is about landlords being kind of open and honest and saying when they've got things wrong. And I think some of the feedback that we've had at the organisation is around the kind of the gloss that has often been put on, like annual reports and various kind of PR type publications, which say, look how great we are as a landlord. And it's sort of, yeah, it's good to get some of those good stories and to hear about the positive things which are being done. But at the same time, if that's kind of over the top, tenants and residents will see straight through that, you know, if it's 99.9% of residents said that they are really happy with this, and they go, well, surely I'm not the only person that was unhappy, and or I'm the nobody asked my view is the kind of the other common thing which you hear. And I don't know if some of the audience probably remember David Montague from L&Q, was in Inside Housing, who he kind of issued a written apology for a number of the tenants. I think it was in Southwark, actually, on one of the estates, where he says, look, yes, we got it wrong. It almost kind of, the very fact that that was newsworthy kind of creates a question mark, doesn't it, about to say, well, where are we as a sector? That if somebody, if a chief executive stands up and says, oh, I'm sorry, we got it wrong, that is kind of, I think it was front page news. It was certainly very high profile news. And actually that should be part of the normal debate, shouldn't it, about delivering landlord service, because everybody understands that things go wrong all of the time. It's about how you deal with that and put things right. And I suspect that the regulatory system has some kind of has in some way contributed to the shifts that we've seen in the last decade about the focus on economic matters, because it's been a focus on economic matters which has also kind of run parallel to a lot of mergers in the sector, the pressure on finances around the rent reduction, and quite right, you've kind of seen this commercialization. But that kind of commercialization is, anybody who's been involved in policy will know that you can kind of put your policy together, but whether it is implemented in the way that you think or creates a whole host of unintended consequences, then I think there's a kind of a similar scenario here on a sector-wide level, is that almost everybody's focus has been on, from a landlord's perspective, on that kind of commercialization agenda. And certainly, what does that mean? And if you look at kind of wider economic theory, I'm quite into the work of Piketty at the moment, and because I think there's something about the Western ideology. Our whole system is based up about kind of maximizing profits for shareholders. And that kind of almost plays out in the housing sector in a way, is that, oh, what's our bottom line to create surpluses to invest in more properties? And that kind of furthers the development. And of course, we've got a shortage and we should be developing more houses. But it kind of, from a cultural perspective, it kind of focuses the board's attention on that bottom line figure for reinvestment. And actually, if you look at some economic models elsewhere in the world, in Japan, in Germany, actually, there's some stuff around Rentchen or Rhine capitalism, which has models where stakeholders and partners and employees are actually part co-owners. And you can kind of see the similarities there, where Rob mentioned earlier about, say, like Sohar or Phoenix, the kind of community gateway models. There's almost a kind of replication there, a recognition. Why is that different? Actually, it holds back some of the share value of those companies in Japan and Germany. But I don't think it's no coincidence that over the past 20 years, Japan and Germany have also been kind of major kind of growth areas, particularly in terms of sort of foreign investments that we've seen. So I think the kind of re-evaluating our perspectives on culture and the importance of actually having a diversity of views, experiences and perspectives in decision making is kind of critical to the culture. And I think that there'll be better and more informed decision making around that. The final part I was just going to mention was about technology goes hand in hand with commercialization and kind of improving the bottom line. But almost the kind of technology is seen as this is inevitable and it's got to happen. And I think there's probably a question about thinking what it is your objectives are that you're trying to deliver first, before plowing ahead on just saying, oh, well, we're going to achieve channel shift because this will achieve a certain percentage improvement in how efficient we are. And therefore, tenants not being done to, but as being part of that debate around the way that services are actually delivered.
Yeah, thanks for that. Some really interesting. But again, one of the things that I think all of you have picked up, and again, there's been a sort of question to is there a danger that a sort of what inevitably will be a sort of because it will be in terms of inspection or regulatory outcomes, league tables, will they perpetuate the negativity that could be around the sector, rather than actually this being seen as a really positive way? So resident engagement should be a really positive thing that organisations do, rather than there's a danger that I know what measure gets done, etc., but league tables and all the rest of it lead to a reinforcement of the negative and the stereo. Fiona.
Andrew, thank you. If I could pick up on that and a few other bits, this has been quite a wide-ranging discussion. We could get into really sort of philosophical kind of discussion around, the merits or demerits of capitalism, but I'm not going to go there. So just sort of standing back for a second. I think, and hopefully some of you listening to this will know this. One of the things we've focused on for a long time actually, is our providers very clear about what their fundamental objectives are? How have they been set? Who's been involved in setting them, and how do they know they're meeting them? So I completely agree with Darren's point about objectives. That's probably at the core of good governance. What are you trying to achieve? And how have you decided what you're trying to achieve, and how do you know that you're achieving it? And I think that really kind of is a kind of key point. And I think actually the economic and the consumer, as we've said already, these are not binary choices. They're not kind of, it's not an either or point. So it's a damn good thing in my mind if you want to kind of make sure that you're making best use of every pound you're getting in, to then think about how you can best spend that to the benefit of your tenants and residents, whether that's your existing tenants and residents or your future tenants and residents. And that speaks to, I think, investment in services, investment in existing homes, and investment in new homes. And I just don't see those things as either contradictory or kind of mutually exclusive or any of those things. You won't keep everyone happy, and we've said this a lot as well in the past. People want different things. You can only spend the same pound once, although my husband doesn't think I actually adhere to that. But there is a kind of, you can only spend the same pound once, so you have to think about what the trade-offs are and the choices that you're making. And you should be, and the white paper absolutely speaks to this, of course you should be involving residents in those discussions and in those choices. As Leslie and others have rightly said, that Optivo work showed that. And fortunately, we've got a new Director of Consumer Regulation appointed who had a big hand in that Optivo work. So, you know, we're so pleased that we've, you know, we've got Kate coming to join us in a few months' time. So I think everything that people have been saying are completely right. And I think this does go to the heart of the culture of organisations and the culture of the, you know, I've said this is, it sounds in some ways really trite. I've said this in other places. Housing associations, it is a bit different for local authorities because it's a housing service within a much wider set of services. Housing associations exist to provide good quality, decent homes to their tenants and good services. And they don't really exist for anything else. So you know, if you're not getting that right in terms of your culture, then you know it's gone adrift. Hopefully that's not where we're going to be. The word league tables has been mentioned the words league tables have been mentioned a few times now, and I might have kind of inadvertently caused that when I talked about not having, you can't have 100% of people in the top quartile. League tables does not get mentioned in the white paper. And that was deliberate because ministers heard loud and clear the message that Leslie and others were given is that, you know, the last thing you want, it adds to stigma. We will not publish league tables. Others might take what we publish and try and turn them into league tables. I can't do anything about that, but we won't be publishing league tables. There's all sorts of reasons why people will be at different places at different times. And the final, sorry, I'm doing a bit of a kind of canter through all of what I've just heard because it's so good. There's so much else we could pick up, but the final point I wanted to pick up was Rob's point on stigma. And again, I'm sure people will have a range of views about why that wasn't kind of carried through into the white paper. I think, and this might just be a personal view rather than a regulatory view, but I think it's really important that stuff around our role was under a chapter headed respect. And you know, respect is well, it will be impossible. Let me just be really clear. It will be impossible to set a consumer standard that talks to respect and that measures it. But you know it when you see it. And you know the contrary when you see the contrary. So you know, of course we're not going to be able to kind of have a big thing in lights that kind of speaks to that. But I think it's important. And again, I've said elsewhere, and you know, you always risk oversimplifying on these things. But if you treat your tenants with respect, you'll get an awful lot of the other things right. And you know, even now, and I accept the points that people have made about our current role. I would refer you to our remit. But even now, within the confines and the constraints of our current role, I see, you know, in terms of consumer regular referrals that, you know, go up the chain, they end up with me. So I see quite a lot of those. And often, given the bar that we have to set at the moment, you know, it doesn't breach the standard. It's not an organisational failure. It's something's gone wrong. It might be a one-off, and it doesn't indicate serious detriment. But we will often, and I'll do it myself, pick up the phone to somebody and say, "Do you realise that that letter went out?" And you know, really, that's kind of, and this is about, you know, again, I think it was Rob that said, you don't, you know, our kind of enforcement powers, we'll use them if we have to. I'm not for it. But we, you know, the ideal scenario is that they're there, that they exist. But it's more than a deterrent. It's because we don't need to, because everybody's kind of doing the right thing. And in that space, you can do. I continue to be surprised by this from time to time. You can do a lot by way of kind of soft regulation. And that is about, you know, trying to speak to people about culture and what you're organizing. It goes right back to where we started in this bit of the conversation. What are your objectives? What are you trying to achieve? How do you know you're doing it? How have you alighted on them? How have you explained to your tenants and residents what their input is? And if you've not gone with everything they've asked for, you know, have you articulated the trade-offs to them? Because you can't do everything. Yeah, I'm going to stop there. That sounded a bit more like an answer. I'm really sorry.
No, thanks for that. We do have to finish at 12:15. Unfortunately, Fiona, needs to leave. So I'm gonna, we've got sort of 4 minutes left, so that's a minute, if my maths is right, for each of the panel, just to say a sort of few concluding remarks. So I'm going to start with you, Leslie, and then Rob, Darren, and then perhaps Fiona, you could just have a sort of a minute at the end. So Leslie.
No stress to try and get it all in. I think just because something is hard to measure doesn't mean that it's not worth measuring. And I think that for me, having the conversations and being able to admit when you're wrong and to be able to work with tenants and exactly what Fiona just said, being, you know, you're not going to be able to do everything, but having the conversation and managing expectations and bringing people into the conversation is, and getting the culture right is, you know, the baseline for everything that's going to be developed on top of that. So it's been great to be on this panel today. Thank you.
Thank you. Rob.
I think I just wanted to say 2 things really. One is that it's important that we have this separate consumer regulation going on. A lot of people have talked about governance over the years and whether this could have been done through governance, but not only would that not work because it wouldn't apply to local authorities, but the 2 things are really different, and kind of governance and board membership is entirely different to your relationship with your broader communities. And oh goodness me, I'll start saying one thing and I always forget the second one. But it was profound and really important. Oh, goodness
I tell you what, let's go to Darren, and then Rob I'll come back to you. You'll remember as soon as Darren speaks.
Yeah,
sure. I mean, I guess as Fiona alluded to a moment ago about how some of the regulator has effectively, I think, been forced by the scheme to operate with its arm tied behind its back, and it's really great that the charter provides an opportunity to be able to remove that. But regardless of the kind of the legislation that's coming down the line, I think the messages are what is the most powerful thing about the direction of travel, where things need to go, and therefore it's within everybody's power in order to be able to kind of embrace those messages and to address their culture and to recognise the importance of really making sure that tenants and residents are the part of everything that a housing organisation, the services it delivers, the decisions that it makes.
Okay, thanks. Rob, you've remembered it.
Yeah, of course, straight away. Yeah, it was about the enforcement powers. I would personally be happy if the enforcement powers were never needed to be used and never need to be used. But it is my opinion that we wouldn't need the Charter for Social Residence if that was really the case. And actually, you know, as much as we complain about having to write this stuff down because it seems so simple to us, I'm still concerned about complacency within the sector about not kind of addressing why the charter exists, and I think there's lots more work to be done around that.
Okay, then finally Fiona.
Okay, it's hard to kind of add when everybody's just said, I think, some really good points. I think if I was to try and sum it up from our perspective, and this is, you know, from where we are now, you know, be clear about your objectives and how you're meeting them, and involve your tenants and residents in setting those. We'll be out talking to people as we shape the new framework, so you'll see lots more of us. And then in terms of, you know, I think this might be Rob's point about complacency. Don't wait. You can see the direction of travel. Start thinking about it now. Just get on with it. If there's things you can get, you know, improve now, just start.
And that's brilliant. I think that's I know start is not the way to end, but it's a great way to end this session. As we entitled it, this is very much a conversation. As Fiona said, she and her teams will be out having those conversations. I know Darren, Leslie, and all of the team at TAROE Trust will be out there also having that conversation. with tenants and residents. We hope as Fusion 21 to play our part in that. My final role is to thank the panel, so a big thank you to Fiona, to Rob, to Leslie, and to Darren for being with us today. A big thank you to you, the audience, also for spending the time and joining in. As I said at the beginning, I know there have been a lot of questions. We haven't had a chance to get round them all, but we will now be looking at your questions and comments and feeding them back. And Darren and Fiona have agreed to comment on some of those questions going forward. So thank you all again for attending. We hope you've enjoyed it. As ever, stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thanks and good afternoon.